thank you for this wonderful life work program, which is obviously really hitting some high points of understanding and articulating and living the Christian life. I've been asked to speak about worldview. Before I do that, I wanted to tell you a rather charming story, which I'm sure is quite apocryphal, about this is an English police inspector who was asked for one day to exchange jobs with a high school teacher. And so he comes into the class he's assigned to teach is what is called in the English school system scripture knowledge. This is something virtually everybody has to do, and it's sort of a routine, sort of pro forma thing, and very often the teachers are not Christians at all, and they hardly know what they're teaching. So the police inspector comes into the class, and he wears a sort of rather stern frown, as befitting his position, and he says, "All right, now, I have one question for you. Who knocked down the walls of Jericho?" And there's a sort of embarrassed silence, a little bit of tittering among the crowd. And then a small boy at the back raises his hand and said, "Excuse me, sir, my name is Bruce Jones, and I didn't do it." So, and I don't know who did it either. So the police inspector thinks this is a rather cheeky response from a kid. So he goes to the school principal and he says, "I asked a simple question, who knocked down the walls of Jericho? And I had this response from your pupil, Bruce Jones. Can't we do better than that?" And the principal said, "Oh, excuse me, sir, I am sure there's a huge mistake. If you wish to make a claim, we'll write a letter to the Ministry of Education, and they may be able to compensate you for this." So that's what happens when you have police inspectors taking the job of teachers. Sometimes it takes an interesting direction. The thing about worldview is, like bad breath or body odor, an awful lot of people have it without knowing that they have it. And you can infer worldview very often from just a few comments or a few answers to questions that people make. But very few people in the whole of the United States, indeed in the whole world, have a thoroughly thought through Christian worldview. It's very rare to find somebody who can, as Andre was telling us, explain what he or she believes, and similarly articulate the situation of the world in light of those beliefs. Most people have a sort of varied hodgepodge of beliefs. Not very concise, very diverse. Some of these are identifiable with a Christian view, but only partially. And of those people who do have worldview beliefs, most of them have what might be called passive beliefs. They don't actively project their understanding of the world either into their own behavior or into their attitudes towards reality around them. Most people are passive, a few are positive and active, and I'll come to that in a moment. One of the most easily identifiable active and positive, but I don't use that word as a compliment, worldviews is the Islamist worldview. Now, this is distinct from a Muslim worldview. we probably all met delightful Muslims who do wonderful jobs. Some of them are patriotic, some of them serve in the military or in other aspects of the government. And they don't want to change very much, if anything, about the American society into which they have settled. They are Muslims, they are not Islamists. Islamists is a category of Muslims. There are some, actually quite a lot, already in the United States, but most of them are located in the Middle East or in Pakistan, who have a very specific set of positive or direct, active views on all kinds of things. Basically, they seek an ultimate caliphate, a return to the situation where Islam was a ruling ideology of a particular part of the world. In the case of Muslims, of course, it started in Arabia. But Islamists want Islam to be a totalitarian global ideology. They don't want it to be something you choose or don't choose. They believe the whole of the human race should be ruled under Islamist principles. And the most important of those principles legally is the Islamic Code of Law, Sharia, which has a number of restrictions and provisions that you've probably all heard quite a bit about at different times. The Islamist worldview is a rather dangerous worldview for a number of reasons, not simply because it's ultimately totalitarian, just as communism was, but also because it has an attitude to ways of thinking which most of us, Christian or secular or agnostic, have taken for granted. For example, most people in most parts of the world accept the validity of the use of reason as a way to making decisions, coming to conclusions about things. But for Islamists, reason is the enemy of Allah. The only ultimate criterion of truth is the revelation of Allah or God in the Quran. Everything that speculates on matters of reality beyond that is not only speculation, but is actually a form of either apostasy or heresy of some kind. Now, this is a very peculiar situation. I need to deal with it just briefly. Islam had a period early in its history when its worldview was actually quite comprehensive and flexible. Around the period about 600 or 700 or 800 AD, there were a group of Muslims who were very open to the writings of the Greek philosophers, very open to the idea of philosophical speculation, of the use of reason as a guide to living a good Muslim life. And as people who thought they could possibly learn something about living the Muslim life from people who were not Muslims. That point of view was shared by a group of people called the Mutazilites. And unfortunately, the Mutazilites were rather dogmatic, and they exerted a serious persecution of people who had the traditional Islamic view, and killed many of them, exiled, imprisoned others. So, when there was a backlash against the Mutazilites, a group called the Ash'arites came to power, and one of their leading philosophers was a man called Al-Ghazali, who wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And essentially what Al-Ghazali did was he said, it is impossible to use reason for any beneficial understanding of the reality of life. The only way you can understand life is to know the Quran, to obey the Quranic precepts, and to hope that Allah, in His inscrutable wisdom, will benefit you in the course of your life. Most of you already know that Islam does not have a doctrine of salvation. There is no way that you can ever be sure that you are good enough for God. You may lead a life which is 52% good and 48% better, and still not get into paradise in the Islamic scheme of things, because God had a bad hair day. It's entirely up to God. There are no theological rules that you can possibly rely upon for salvation within the Islamic scheme of things. However, there is one way that you can guarantee paradise, and that is by dying in jihad. That if you are fighting, defending, or expanding Islam, and you die in that process, you die as a martyr in the Islamic concept of the word. And you become a person who has died in jihad, and that gets you automatically into heaven, into paradise. Now, it's significant how this affects the Islamist view of the behavior and the world, and I'll give you just two examples of this. There were two British Muslims of originally Pakistani background who were arrested in Israel a couple of years ago for plotting a suicide bomb. Fortunately, the plot went awry. They were arrested before they could implement this rather dastardly plan, and they were interrogated by the Israeli intelligence, and then they were actually interviewed by international television crews. And they said something that was very interesting, and I'll tell you why in relation to another quote from an Islamist. They said, and I'll imitate the North Country British accent of this couple, the difference between you and us is that you love life and we love death. That's what they said. Now, you may have recalled the shooting at Fort Hood by Major Malik Hassan. Major Malik Hassan, in one of the presentations to fellow physicians at a military hospital where he was assigned, gave multiple explanations of why Islam was a superior way of life, a superior philosophy and religion to everything else. He said exactly the same thing. The difference between you and us is you love life and we love death. Now that's the Islamist view, and of course it's I think we would all consider it a very extreme view and a rather repulsive view. But it's one of the clearly identifiable worldviews that is articulated positively, or at least articulated actively, by certain groups of people, both in the United States and around the world. There are a few other positive worldviews. I won't go into all of them, but you've all heard, of course, of communism or Marxism-Leninism. This is espoused by a handful of people in China, in the Chinese Communist Party, in Cuba, and in Vietnam, and not to forget, of course, by a large number of United States college professors who seem to espouse this particular philosophy of life. Their view is very simple. Capitalism and freedom, the freedom in which capitalism develops, is going to collapse ultimately, and the world will move in the direction of a proletarian revolution in which the Communist Party will emerge from the chaos and direct societies all over the world into a future utopia of socialist collectivism. That's the world Marxist-Leninist view. You still find a few people in these countries I've mentioned believing that, probably more Americans than Chinese these days, but because anybody who's experienced Marxism-Leninism at first hand is exceedingly depressed by the consequences of that kind of rule. There are some neo-Nazis, the third line of thinking. You find neo-Nazis in Europe, in Germany, in Sweden, in other Scandinavian countries. And these are people who basically subscribe to a victim mentality, just as the original Nazis did. The original Nazis who surrounded Adolf Hitler had a beef. Germany had been humiliated, had been deprived of its legitimate rights as a major power. The Treaty of Versailles was grossly unfair, had stripped Germany of its wealth, and Germany had a duty to itself, to its future, and indeed to the world, to recover the legacy which it had lost. The neo-Nazis are people who also claim victimhood. We are Germans, we are Swedes who are being inundated in our own countries by those Muslim immigrants. And so neo-Nazi political activism in Europe is directed very strongly against any further immigration. It has both an anti-Muslim component and an anti-Semitic component, because in the end, virtually anybody who's of foreign or different origin is considered suspect and a threat to the purity of the regime or the national background. Then there's great power nationalist realism. I would say that is the worldview of Russians and Chinese, even if in the China case they happen to be members of the Communist Party. They're basically people who think Russia has a destiny in the world which has probably been suppressed by foreigners. Russians are always writing editorials about being encircled by the Americans. And the Chinese are always saying that America is trying to blockade China and impose limits on China's ability to assume its destiny as a world power. So those are what you might call great power nationalist realists. And then in the US, there's a real mishmash of worldviews, and I want to go through them so you can identify some of your friends who may subscribe to these different varieties of worldview. First, of course, there are Christians in this country who are articulate, have a deep personal faith, live out their Christian lives in a laudatory way, and can explain their worldview, which is that they believe the United States has been called by God for a special purpose, and that the original American settlers came to the United States in order to establish a Christian commonwealth, if you like, which ultimately could be a blessing for the whole world. Now, I'm not saying all of the people who subscribe to this believe every part of it, but the view of America as a Christian creation is very strong in this group. Secondly, and I think this applies to most Americans today, because opinion polls continuously confirm the fact that Americans tend to regard themselves as conservative rather than liberal. Most Americans still believe in American exceptionalism. They think that when they sing the song "God Bless America," they believe it. And some of them may actually pray occasionally, and they probably pray for God to bless America. They believe we Americans still have some kind of spiritual role in the world, some kind of practical role, although they may not be very clear what that is. But basically, they still believe in American exceptionalism. Third, many Americans, not very religious, believe that the US did the right thing in opposing Hitler and Japanese militarism, and perhaps in containing Soviet communism so that ultimately democracy came to Europe or Eastern Europe and Russia at the end of the Cold War. But they are not very sure that things are moving in the right direction in this country. They certainly don't have the same kind of belief in America's spiritual role that others have. They're a lot more pluralistic in their attitudes. They may not be churchgoers, and if they are churchgoers, their theology may be kind of liberal and maybe a little wishy-washy. So they're people on the edge of a complete change of worldview. Their parents were probably American exceptionalists. Some of their friends may be, but their children almost certainly are not. And in the next generation, the children of this group of Americans will have a very different worldview unless the Holy Spirit is graceful enough to intervene and cause a great conversion. Finally, the fourth category are American secularists who believe that the belief in American exceptionalism is wrong, who believe that America was never a special nation, was never particularly Christian. America, they believe, was not called by God to be a nation. There is no absolute truth, they believe. God may exist, but there's certainly no plausible way to get to know him. And in fact, they also believe that Americans may have been the cause of many of the things that have gone wrong, not just in this country, but around the world. They think all values are relative. There is no good and evil. There are only beneficial and harmful acts that are demonstrated in various degrees. But it's the job of the government, not of individuals or the church, to decide which actions of people or groups are right and wrong, and how we should create remedies to prevent their happening in the future. It's a real mishmash of different viewpoints in this collection of worldviews of Americans that I've explained. But there are two main sources of influence on American worldviews that we really need to understand. The first, and I think the most important, is the world of entertainment media, the world of Hollywood and TV. There's a real reason for that. For some reason, creative people who are drawn to Hollywood tend to subscribe to the most extreme radicalism of worldviews that are experimental or progressive or liberal, and in general are very anti-Christian. That is why the movie critic, who is Jewish actually, Michael Medved, wrote a book several years ago called Hollywood versus America. And what he showed was that when people produce a movie which is family friendly, which promotes patriotism and charitable values and civic virtue, the movie almost invariably does well at the box office. People want to see those kind of movies. But Hollywood has consistently produced really vulgar, extreme, and totally anti-Christian and anti-religious movies because the script writers and some of the studios are so locked into this relativistic, radical individualistic view of the world that they are more desirous of seeing this idea being expressed in creative form than they are in making money. I mean, that doesn't make sense, but that seems to be the case.